Welcome again to the Ann B. Shepard Fall Lecture Series given by the Princeton Adult School. I'm Holly Smith, Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers University and a member of the Adult School's Board of Directors. It's my great pleasure to introduce my departmental colleague, Jeff McMahon, who will present our lecture this evening. A Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, Professor McMahon received 2 bachelor's degrees, one in English Literature at the University of the South and one in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics from Oxford, an MA from Oxford, and a PhD from Cambridge University. He joined the Rutgers Department of Philosophy in 2003, following a long appointment at the University of Illinois and a visiting fellowship at the Princeton University Center for Human Values, where he continues to hold an appointment as a research collaborator. While still a graduate student at Cambridge, Professor McMahon published 3 books on the morality of nuclear deterrence. It's testimony to his stature on the topic that in 1989, only 3 years after completing his PhD, he was selected as only one of 5 American philosophers to participate with a group of Soviet philosophers in an exchange on nuclear confrontation. Professor McMahon's interest in moral issues surrounding war led to the publication of many more articles and books in this arena, including books entitled The Morality of Nationalism, and 3 more books from Oxford University Press, all just about to appear or maybe in press, Killing in War, the Oxford Uhiro Lectures, The Ethics of Killing, Self-Defense, War and Punishment, and The Morality and Law of War. Many critics believe that these works have established Professor McMahon as the leading philosophical writer on the ethics of war. Fortunately, we're not concerned in this lecture series with war, but rather with bioethics. Here, too, Professor McMahon has come to be regarded as one of the best contemporary moral philosophers working in bioethics. He has contributed numerous articles in this area, and also what is regarded as his most impressive book so far, entitled The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, which came out from Oxford in 2002. It looks at the ethics of ending what he calls marginal lives, for example, the lives of animals and the lives of human beings who are not fully persons, such as fetuses, or those with late Alzheimer's disease. Critics have described this book as the best moral philosophy book of the current decade. And the Times Literary Supplement notes that, quote, there could be no better proof of the paradoxical vitality of the subject of death and killing than this monumental work. Given the enthusiastic reception that Professor McMahon's work has received, he has been inundated with invitations to present prestigious lectures, many to international audiences. We're fortunate to have secured him for this evening's Shepard Lecture Series. Please help me welcome Professor Jeff McMahon, who will speak to us on cognitive impairment and enhancement.
Thank you very much, Holly. Yeah, this is working, isn't it? That introduction sounded a lot better than the reality. I hope you won't be too disappointed. That's a lot to live up to. Holly told me before I came that you were used to having visual material, PowerPoint, something like that. I've never done that. I'm just a philosophy professor. I say we, some of us, a lot of us just haven't advanced that far yet. I figure this is the Princeton Adult School, and so we don't need those cartoons and stuff for tonight. You can do without that. Okay, thank you. And I was thinking earlier today that that's what Ronald Reagan's advisors often had to do with him when they were giving him briefings about things. They would have little cartoon things to teach him stuff. So we'll assume that that you don't need that stuff. I also see that you've been getting some bioethics lectures of real practical relevance in here. A lot of what I write about as a philosopher is of great practical relevance. But tonight I'm really going to talk about things that are a little more far out that I hope are going to provide some philosophical puzzles for you to think about, some challenges to our thinking about some issues, some of which are confronting us right now, are real and practical, some of which are for the future, but they are things that we should be thinking about now. My topic is really going to be variations in human psychological and in particular cognitive capacity. And I'm going to focus on, as the title indicates, both cognitive deficits and the possibility of cognitive enhancement in human beings. Now, cognitive impairment in human beings obviously comes in degrees. It ranges from very mild mental retardation all the way to complete absence of psychological capacity whatsoever, as in the case of anencephalic infants who have no higher brain at all. Some of the most difficult puzzles, as well as moral problems, arise in the case of human beings whose overall psychological and, in particular, cognitive capacities and potential are comparable to or lower than those of some non-human animals. Now, I'm going to refer to human beings in this category as the radically cognitively limited or radically cognitively limited human beings. I had to make up this ugly term because I discovered to my embarrassment that the more familiar terms that one might use in this context, such as profound mental retardation or something of that sort, already have technical meanings in the healthcare profession. So I don't want to make mistakes in classification, so I've invented my own category. Remember, so what's defining about the human beings that I'm going to be most concerned with this evening is that these are human beings with very, very low cognitive capacities. So below the level of some non-human animals. For example, the highest non-human animals like chimpanzees. Now, there do seem to be human beings who meet this description. And you can see how that could be the case. All of us actually acquire our psychological capacities incrementally as we develop. We start off as fetuses with the bare capacity for consciousness, and we gradually progress to possess the kind of capacities that we have now. So each of us once had much lower cognitive capacities than we have now, and presumably at some point along this gradient from bare minimal consciousness to high cognitive capacity, we must for a while have ourselves had capacities lower than those of, let's say, a chimpanzee. And there's no reason to suppose that it's not possible for a human being's psychological capacities and cognitive capacities in particular to be permanently arrested at some low level early on in the development of cognitive capacity. And it's also possible that through defect or malfunctioning of the genes in a person's body that code for the development of the brain, or perhaps the absence of some of those genes, the congenital absence of some of those genes, there are human beings who are congenitally without any potential for the development of the areas of the brain that are responsible for our having the kind of high cognitive capacities that we in fact have. Now, of course, psychological capacity and in cognitive capacity are multidimensional. So there may be no actual human being whose psychological capacities quite generally are identical to those of any animal. So that's not the claim. But the claim is that across a broad spectrum of the most important psychological capacities that we have, and in particular cognitive or intellectual capacity, there are some human beings who are congenitally below the level of the higher non-human animals and also lack the potential for achieving a level of cognitive capacity comparable to that of a higher non-human animal. So suppose that there is a late-term human fetus or a newborn infant that's radically cognitively limited in this way. That is, this infant, let's say, is now in a position where it has no potential for cognitive development or progression. Its cognitive capacities are going to remain at the level of a newborn infant, below the level of a higher non-human animal. But suppose that we have a form of genetic therapy, a form of genetic intervention that would enable us to correct this problem. That is, it would enable us to endow this infant with normal cognitive capacities, or to endow it with the potential to develop those capacities. And just so you'll know, it's virtually certain that we will eventually have this capacity. This is not science fiction. We're on the verge of being able to manipulate genes in all sorts of remarkable ways. So to believe that this could never happen, I think, is wishful thinking. We may destroy ourselves before we get to the point where we can actually do this kind of stuff, but if we don't, and if science continues to advance, something like this will become possible eventually, assuming with enough time. Actually, I think it'll probably happen a lot sooner rather than later. You may, if you continue to have bioethics lectures, get Lee Silver from Princeton. I forget what he's, microbiology or something like molecular biology, I think it is, and also at the Woodrow Wilson School. He's a well-known writer on these issues, and I've talked with him about this stuff, and he thinks that it's going to happen very soon. So anyway, assume that this is possible. Do we have a moral reason to enhance the cognitive capacities of this radically cognitively limited or otherwise radically cognitively limited infant? And if so, why? I think most people think that we do. The question is why? Well, there are obvious social reasons why we would want to do that. We would want to enhance the infant's capacities for the sake of the parents, assuming that the parents would prefer to have a child with normal cognitive capacities than a child with radical cognitive limitation and complete sort of dependency. Also, it would be better for the society not to have to bear the burden of caring throughout the individual's life for an individual with this kind of the kind of dependency that is consequent upon the possession of such low capacities. But the question I want to think about today is whether it would be good for that individual to undergo this kind of cognitive enhancement, and how much, and if so, how much moral reason that would give us for engaging in the enhancement or providing the enhancement for this individual. There's another question that we might think about, though I won't discuss this question to the same extent this evening, and that is whether there would be a similar reason, or what kind of reason there might be, to enhance the cognitive capacities of a radically cognitively limited adult human being. Suppose you've got an adult human being who's had very low cognitive capacities throughout the whole of his life. Suppose it would become possible during that person's life to enhance his cognitive capacities, to bring him up to normal level. Would we have reason to do that? Well, let me suggest that there would be a couple of in-principle constraints on the desirability of this kind of thing. One, I'll call the identity constraint. Actually, I don't know why I need to give it a label because I'm not going to refer back to it, but it's something that you might want to be aware of. On some theories about our identity as individuals, there are certain forms of radical psychological change that we could not survive. So on some theories of personal identity in philosophy, if you have a total form of sort of psychological discontinuity, that's sufficient for, in effect, the ceasing to exist of one person and the beginning to exist of another. So whenever we're thinking about cognitive enhancement, one constraint on the desirability of the procedure is that it should actually preserve the existence of the individual whose enhancement is in prospect. A second constraint is that it should be good for or in the interests of the individual to be enhanced, assuming that the enhancement would be compatible with the preservation of identity. What I have in mind here is that you can imagine certain forms of enhancement that would involve so much discontinuity in the psychology of an individual that it would be not literally the creation of a new person, but something so like the creation of a new person that involving the disappearance of so much of the original individual and its replacement by something new. We wouldn't really want to think of that as being good for the original individual. So much of that person's prior identity could be lost. Identity in the self-constituting way. Here I don't mean that the person would cease to exist, but that the person would change so much that that degree of psychological change would not be desirable. Now, those constraints, I think, raise problems in principle about great cognitive enhancement in a pre-existing individual. They probably have less relevance in the case of cognitive enhancement for a late-term fetus or a newborn infant just beginning to exist. So that, there's not much there to begin with. You can just imagine thinking of this individual as either starting life with a very low set of capacities or starting life with on a trajectory towards the development of higher capacities. So I'm going to put those constraints aside at the moment, and I want to ask, in the case of our late-term fetus or newborn infant, is there a moral reason to enhance the cognitive capacities of that individual for that individual's own sake if it were possible to do this? Would there be such a reason? Now, I think most of us think that there would be, that this would be something that it would be morally important to do. Well, here's your first puzzle. Here's the first thing to think about. And I want you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind throughout what I'm going to have to say during the remainder of the talk. Remember that I've stipulated that what I mean by a radically cognitively limited human being is a member of our species, a human being, whose psychological capacities and potentials are no higher than those of some higher non-human animal. So if we think that there is a moral reason to enhance the cognitive capacities of a newborn infant for that infant's own sake, why wouldn't there be a similar reason to enhance the cognitive capacities of non-human animals? What's the difference? Why would there be more reason in the case of the human being than in the case of the animal? Well, here's one contingent reason, one answer that you might give, and that is that When we think about radically cognitively limited human beings, we're thinking about individuals who are utterly dependent for their survival and well-being on other human beings. This dependency is a misfortune. And that, I think, is a good reason for thinking of these human beings as disabled and unfortunate. And that differentiates them from animals with otherwise overall comparable cognitive capacities, because animals, however low their sort of intellectual endowments are, nevertheless are equipped with the instincts they need in order to survive in reasonable comfort. So the lack of cognitive capacity in human beings is instrumentally disadvantageous in a way that it's not for most animals. So that might be one ground for saying that there's a reason to enhance radically cognitively limited human beings. It doesn't apply in the case of animals. That is, it's instrumentally disadvantageous for the human beings, but not so for the animals. But I think that is really only a rather small part of why we think it would be good to enhance the capacities of the human being. It's not just that it's instrumentally disadvantageous or unfortunate to lack cognitive capacity. I think what most people believe is that there's something particularly sort of intrinsically unfortunate for a human being about having abnormally low cognitive capacities. And I think we believe that because we think that the nature of the good for a human being is given by our species membership. That is, we have a conception of the good for a human being that's different from our conception of the good for an animal. So any human being who falls short of what's normal for a human being has suffered a misfortune, even if that individual has capacities very little different from those of an animal and may actually even have a life that just subjectively is even more pleasant than that of an animal. Still, there's something terribly unfortunate about being in that condition because it's a falling short of the species norm. Well, let me suggest a few reasons to be skeptical about this idea. One is that infants and children all have low cognitive capacities and actually are dependent for their survival and well-being on adults. And yet we don't think of them as suffering a misfortune while they're in that condition. We don't think of them as unfortunate for being in that condition. We don't even consider their dependency to be a misfortune, even of an instrumental nature. And we don't consider them to be disabled. We don't call children temporarily cognitively disabled. Why is that? Well, there's an obvious response to this concern, and that is that when we're relativizing our notion of the good, we shouldn't do it just to an individual species, but we have to do it also to stage of life. So there's the good life for a young human being, a good life for human beings of different ages. I think that's no good. And that's because, well, here's one reason anyway. That's because at the very late stages of human life, for the very elderly, a certain degree of psychological decline a certain degree of cognitive deterioration is actually natural and normal. That's what happens. That is the norm for human beings. If we are relativizing the good for human beings, not just to what's, the idea of what's good for us as human beings, but also what's good for us as human beings at different stages of life, if that's the norm for that stage of life, then we can't recognize that as a misfortune for human beings to undergo cognitive decline near the end of life. And yet I think we all think that that is a misfortune. I think it's very puzzling, as just putting on my philosopher's hat. I think it's very puzzling why we think that childhood is a happy, desirable state. Actually, going back to one of the earliest really good, serious philosophers, Aristotle, he had the opposite view. I'm going to give you a brief quotation from Aristotle. This is from his Eudaimonean Ethics. He has a similar passage in the Nicomachean Ethics. Here, the quotation is a little bit nicer from the earlier work, so I'll give you that one. He says, "The life we lead as children is not desirable, for no one in his senses would consent to return to this again." Now, the second clause there is right, isn't it? When you return to that again, that's called dementia. Second childhood. And we don't look forward to that. We dread that. So why don't we think of children as unfortunate people who are sort of temporarily demented, who are going to get over it? Well, we don't. We think back, those idyllic childhood years, how nice, the innocence, and so on. Well, you could become innocent again as long as you forgot all the terrible things you've learned from being alive for a while. Anyway, I'll leave you with that puzzle. I don't know what to say about it. There's been very little reflection about this kind of thing. But for our purposes, the point is that the radically cognitively limited who remain that way throughout the whole of their lives are like permanent children. I mean, they're called sort of permanently infantile. But if being a child isn't a misfortune, why should the sort of indefinite continuation of that state be a misfortune? That's one way to think about this. And that challenges, I think, the idea that our idea of what it is to be a human being gives us a kind of model against which, or by comparison with which, the radically cognitively limited fail or do poorly. Here's another thing to think about. I've said that the possibility of genetic cognitive enhancement is something that is going to happen one of these days. We don't know how far it'll go. I'm going to ask you a little bit later to imagine that it might go really far. But if we're going to be able to do this for human beings, and in particular radically cognitively limited human beings, if we're going to be able to introduce genes that will enable their brains to develop in different ways that will give them normal cognitive capacities, we're also going to have the capacity to do that for animals as well. So now imagine that we've reached that point and that we have genetically produced, genetically engineered, starting at the zygote stage or the embryo stage, a chimpanzee with cognitive and psychological capacities that are pretty normal for a human being. This is a chimpanzee that writes poetry in its spare time and reads Aristotle and reflects about why childhood among human beings is regarded as a happy state, that kind of thing. So, you imagine that we've got this chimpanzee now, cognitively enhanced chimpanzee, and suppose that chimpanzee is suddenly threatened with some kind of brain damage that's going to reduce its cognitive capacities to the level of those of a normal chimpanzee. If what's good for an individual is given by the norms for that individual species, then this shouldn't be a misfortune at all for the chimpanzee. The chimpanzee comes to us and says, I'm getting ready to have this, I don't know what it'd be, a cerebral aneurysm or something that's going to reduce me to the state of a normal chimpanzee. Oh, woe is me. We're not going to be able to comfort him by saying, look, don't worry about it. You're just going to become like one of your conspecifics. This is perfectly okay. You'll be doing well for a chimpanzee. He's not going to like that argument. And that makes me worry about the idea that the nature of the good is given by some kind of norm for the species. Here's another reason for worrying about that idea. This is the last reason I'm going to give you. And that is that the norms for our species aren't given by the nature of our species at any particular time. Human beings have been around for a long time. And if you think about our earliest human ancestors, the earliest instances of human beings or members of our species, you'll realize that their psychological capacities, their cognitive capacities, were probably a lot closer to those of a present-day chimpanzee than they were to those of a present-day human being like us. And the nature of our species could change equally radically over time in the future. Normally, these changes, of course, take place over long periods of time because evolution is very slow. Cognitive evolution is very slow. But we could speed that up with genetic enhancement. It could be that within a generation or two, the norm for the human species through germline genetic intervention could be very different from what it is now. They might still be human beings. They would still count as members of our species. So in a way, the nature of our species is both variable over time and kind of indeterminate for the future. I don't think it gives us a fixed standard for the evaluation of what's good for us, unless you limit it to what's good for people like us now, which seems to me rather arbitrary, particularly when what we're trying to do is to figure out why certain human beings are unfortunate, why they are poorly off, why they are sort of intrinsically disadvantaged. Okay. So, unless we have some kind of good explanation for some good reason for thinking that radically cognitively limited human beings are unfortunate while comparably endowed animals aren't, we're not going to have a basis for claiming that while there is a moral reason for enhancing a radically cognitively limited infant, there's not a moral reason for enhancing a non-human animal with comparable psychological endowments. And that's a problem. Okay, so that's one puzzle I want to throw out for your consideration. We can, of course, talk about this in the discussion. Here's something else to think about. Suppose we believe, as I think most of us do, that there's a moral reason to enhance radically cognitively limited and other human beings with cognitive impairments of a lesser degree or lesser magnitude. If we think that there's reason to bring them up to the normal level, shouldn't we also think that there would be an equal reason to take normal human beings and give them exactly the same therapy to take them even higher? That is, if this kind of thing is going to work to bring subnormal human beings up to the normal level, suppose we could give exactly the same genetic therapy to all of us, and we would, our cognitive abilities would increase by a comparable degree. Would that be a good thing? Well, I'm just going to report to you that most people think it wouldn't be. Most people seem to be very averse to the idea of cognitive enhancement for human beings. We tend to distinguish, if you look at the literature, people tend to distinguish between therapeutic uses of genetic intervention, that is, ones that repair deficiencies or prevent loss of cognitive capacity, on the one hand, and enhancement on the other. And while people think therapeutic uses are acceptable, enhancing uses are unacceptable. Now, I find that a bit puzzling, and that's because what's normal now in the way of cognitive endowment for human beings would have been very high for our remote ancestors, and yet we don't think that it's bad that we're smarter than our remote ancestors. Similarly, if the human species were just going to go on as it has gone on for a very, very long period of time, our descendants would, in the course of time, develop higher cognitive capacities than we have now. We wouldn't think that would be a bad thing. We don't think that we should somehow take some kind of preventive steps to make sure that our descendants don't get any smarter than we are. That wouldn't be pleasing to anybody. So one thing to think about here is that genetic cognitive enhancement would just accelerate what's going to happen naturally anyway, though over a very long period of time. So why is it that people think, well, we should do what we can to prevent cognitive decline? That is, if people were threatened with some kind of cognitive decline, we would think it would be okay to give them some kind of genetic therapy to prevent the decline. And we think it's good to repair deficiencies where they exist. All of this is relative to the normal level now, but we don't want to use genetic means to raise the level. I've just suggested that if you think about the evolution, there's nothing about the norm now that should be particularly sacrosanct, nor, I think, does anybody really think that the present level, present average level or whatever, is somehow optimal. Suppose I told you that scientists have just discovered that if you eat some kind of food, a whole lot more than anybody has ever eaten this food before, it will have this effect of causing people's brains to grow a bit, and you'll add 10 points to your IQ that way. Would you want to try it? Yeah, I mean, even if it were Brussels sprouts or something like that, which I had for lunch today. Yeah, we would. If you could do this nutritionally, through nutritional means, even if what you were doing was affecting the wiring and the growth of the brain, if we could figure out a way to do that through nutrition, that would be okay. But when people think about inserting genes to do it, we get worried about it. So people are worried, I think, about the genetic means that would be employed. And I think that's very puzzling because in other cases, I think we wouldn't worry so much about the use of a genetic means to enhance ourselves in certain ways. So, for example, suppose a scientist were to discover a kind of foolproof, a completely safe genetic therapy that would enhance people's immune systems by, let's say, 10%. You get a 10% increase in efficiency of your immune system if you have this thing. So you'd be much less likely to get all kinds of diseases. Would you, this costs $5. I would pay for it. Would you? I think you would too. So we wouldn't have these reservations about the genetic means of enhancement where something like immunity was concerned. So why do people worry about cognitive enhancement? Well, I don't know. I think here are a couple of nasty speculations. That is, they're not very flattering to us. I think some of us may think to get smarter, you have to work for it. You have to deserve it. And if you can just get it through a little injection or something, that's somehow cheating. But I just don't think that makes any sense at all. I mean, I have higher cognitive capacities than my ancestors 10,000 years ago had, but I didn't work for it. It was just handed to me by natural selection. And we would accept genetically enhanced immunity, and nobody thinks, well, you shouldn't get a better immune system without working for it. You have to eat a lot of broccoli and exercise a lot for that kind of thing. No, if we could get enhanced immunity from a shot, we'd all think it would be a good idea. Here's another reason, and I have to confess, this lurks somewhere back in the recesses of my mind, and that is that I think a lot of us worry about being kind of left behind. Suppose we could do it pretty quickly. I don't want my children to be, I want my children to be smart, but I don't want them to be 5 times as smart as I am. So that they, read my philosophy book in a few minutes and laugh at it and point out all the fallacies and then burn it. Like some work of some primitive being. That would be bad. Well, all right. I've got about 10 or 12 more minutes, I think, before I should stop. Let me say something now I'm going to change directions a little bit and think about moral status. Because all of these questions about cognitive capacity are relevant to understanding our moral status. When I teach undergraduate bioethics classes, I try to get people to think about the basis of our moral status, and in particular of the idea that we are somehow inviolable, that we have these fundamental human rights that make us inviolable, rights that animals don't have. I ask them, okay, why is it that it would be less seriously morally wrong to kill a squirrel outside the classroom window than it would be to kill an undergraduate outside the classroom window? So I asked my undergraduates that, and to my surprise, they don't come up with what I think they ought to say, given what they probably really believe. They don't say, oh, it's just because we're human beings and they're not. And they don't say, well, it's because we have immortal souls and they don't, or that we're made in the image of God and they look like squirrels instead. They don't say any of that. What they say is, and this is invariant, they always say this, they say, maybe it's just because I'm a philosophy professor and they expect that this is the way to get a good grade, and they know I'm not going to like it if they say, they look, made in the image of God and the squirrel isn't. What they say is, it's because we're self-conscious and they're not. It's because we are rational and they're not. Because we know the difference between right and wrong and they don't. Because we're able to use language and they can't. Because we have free will, by which they mean something like we can act on the basis of reasons and on the basis of deliberation, and they can't, and so on. Basically what they give me is a list of cognitive capacities. And they say, that's really what fundamentally differentiates us morally from non-human animals. But you can see why that's a problem now, given what I've said earlier. They are listing for us a bunch of higher cognitive capacities that they think are relevant to our moral status, that we have, that is those of us in this room or those of us in the classroom, that squirrels outside the window don't. And I point out to them, well, fetuses don't have those qualities. And they say, yeah, but fetuses will have them. They have the potential. And I say, well, there are people in persistent vegetative state who don't have them. And they say, well, they used to have them. And then I say, well, there's some human beings, and of course you know who they are now, the radically cognitively limited, who don't have them, who don't have the potential to have them, who've never had them, and so on. And yet, we don't think that it's permissible to treat radically cognitively limited human beings the way we treat animals. We don't think it's permissible to cut them up and take their organs for transplantation, though we don't do that much with animals, though we would if we could. We don't eat them, we don't hunt them, etc., etc. So there's another puzzle here, this time a moral puzzle. Can we defend these common sense beliefs in a way that makes them consistent? think what we really have to do, if we're going to succeed in defending the intuitions, is to find a different basis for our high moral status, something that we share with radically cognitively limited human beings, but from which animals are excluded. The problem is, there doesn't seem to be anything that is recognizably morally important that fills the bill here. So we've got a real problem. I mean, I welcome your suggestions, but I've been welcoming my students' suggestions and other people's suggestions for years, and I haven't heard anything that's really convincing yet. So I think we've got a serious problem. If we can't find a good answer to this challenge, then I think we don't really understand the basis of our own moral status very well, and that's a problem. Maybe we could make some progress with our thinking about this kind of problem by considering the possibility of greatly cognitively and psychologically enhanced human beings. This is what some people do. You've heard of these people that call themselves transhumanists. Have you heard of those people? Well, they're thinking about what it's going to be like when we really do have genetically enhanced human beings around. There's a name for these as yet mythological beings. People call them posthumans. These beings who are, I mean, think of it this way. For our purposes, we'll go off into science, what's currently science fiction anyway, and imagine that we could genetically, through genetic means, create, whether in the next generation or a few generations down the line, genetic progeny of ours whose cognitive and general psychological capacities would exceed our own by more than ours exceed those of non-human animals, say chimpanzees. So if you're think how much smarter you are than a chimpanzee, and you imagine some genetic descendant of ours who's smarter than you are by more than you're smarter than the chimpanzee. So think about that. We'll call these people posthumans. If you think that species membership is important to moral status, which, as you've probably been able to gather, I don't. It's just a fact about biology. Then it's going to be important for you to figure out whether these posthumans would be members of our species or not. If they are, maybe, problem solved. I don't think so, but you might take some comfort in that. These just be really smart human beings, but all human beings have, have the same moral status. We're all equal, and so on and so forth. But suppose I told you, well, actually, we'll just make them a different species while we're making them smarter as well. I don't know, whatever a biologist tells me to do to make them a different species, I'll make them a different species. Now the problem is not solved, because you've now got a higher species. So we don't have to think of them as our equals just because they're members of our species. So what kind of moral status would these people have? And what ought they to conclude from their point of view about our moral status? Remember, we're looking down at the chimpanzees from a certain distance, and we're saying, boy, they sure are different from us. We can do whatever we want to with them. If we could now harvest organs from chimpanzees to save the lives of human children, we would do it. You know that. So here are the posthumans, and they're looking down at us, and we're even a greater distance from them than chimpanzees are from us. And maybe they haven't solved all their medical problems yet. They're putting their big brains to work to see if they can avoid this problem in future. But for right now, they still need organs for transplantation, and we've got them. Can they just treat us the way we treat chimpanzees? Would that be okay? We don't really, I think, most of us believe that we are literally inviolable. So imagine, for example, that the only way that you could save make it as many as you like, I don't know, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 innocent people from being wrongfully killed. The only way you could do that would be to kill one innocent person yourself. I think most of us think, if it's just 2 people, I can't do it, but you increase the numbers enough, we'll get almost everybody on board for killing an innocent person to save that many other innocent people. So we don't really think that we're inviolable, most of us, in a deep sense. We just think that there are sort of what we have degrees of violability, and we have the kind of lowest degree of violability, or to put it the other way around, the highest degree of inviolability, but it's not absolute inviolability. Well, once these post-humans are around, then our status might change. We would become more violable. That is, maybe I could kill one innocent, normal person now to save the lives of 1,000 or 10,000 other innocent people. But I might not be able to do that to a post-human. And post-humans might think that they could use us in the way that we think it, as I said a moment ago, it's permissible for us to use chimpanzees. So, I should probably stop. I've been going almost 45 minutes. Let me just say, I said I wasn't going to use visual things, but let me just do this. I think this will work. Here's the view that we have, that I think would be the kind of common sense view now. We take account of post-humans. We have this kind of threshold above which we think of people as having kind of equal moral status. So there's us, kind of the cognitively normal. And we're above this threshold. Animals are below it. It's okay to sacrifice them if necessary. And each animal's moral status really does, I mean, this is interesting. Each animal's moral status does seem to depend on its psychological capacities. So we would be much more reluctant to sacrifice a chimpanzee than we would a housefly or something like that. So their moral status varies with degree of psychological capacity. But somehow or other, we have the radically, I'm just going to abbreviate here, the radically cognitively limited are above the threshold with us. And now we're imagining post-humans. And one of the questions is whether we might find another threshold up here where they might have a degree of inviolability that's kind of discontinuous with us in the way that we're discontinuous with animals. That's one, that's something like the common sense picture here, though I think probably most people wouldn't like to recognize that little possible threshold there. Now, if you take seriously the idea that psychological capacity really is the foundation of our moral status, if I were to take literally what my undergraduates say when I ask them, okay, what differentiates us morally from a squirrel? When it really comes to the crunch, when we're talking about something like killing, what's the foundation of the prohibition against killing people that doesn't extend to the killing of animals? We take cognitive capacity seriously, or psychological capacity quite generally, as what's important. We're going to get something that looks like this. We're going to get post-humans at the top, threshold. We're going to get us here in the middle, and we're going to get radically cognitively limited and animals down here. And of course, these are going to be porous. These aren't going to be sharp line thresholds. They're going to be rough thresholds. So chimpanzees are going to have higher status, as I said, than voles or earthworms or whatever. And that's going to be another possible view. Point here is we have to give some thought to this kind of thing. Now that we're able to contemplate all the beings in their positions in this sort of great chain of being. Of course, in the past, radically cognitively limited human beings didn't survive. So there was just us and animals, and that was all people were able to conceive of, except for angels and God and other kind of supernatural beings who occupied rungs in the great chain of being. But now we know things are different. We know that all of this is kind of a matter of, all of this business of endowment, psychological endowment, is manipulable, it's malleable, it's a matter of biology, it's not fixed categories given by natural law or by natural kinds. And so we have to rethink questions of moral status here. And I do think that this, once we start thinking about the broad spectrum of possibilities here, the idea that there's just kind of one threshold, and we just slipped in right above it, and all those like us, we just managed to get in above it, and all those other critters are down there below it, and no matter how much improvement there is in the natures of possible beings, there's just never going to be another line. We're going to always be equal to anything that comes along. That looks suspiciously like a kind of product of self-interest to me, rather than a really impartial, sort of dispassionate assessment. Okay, so we'll stop there, and I've gone on, I think, longer than I should have, but we can have questions for however long Holly will let them go for. Okay, thanks. Okay, I don't know anybody's names. Most of the questions seem to be in the middle, in the white shirt in the middle there, and then in the back there. Yeah.
I'm really offended by your use of the term moral status.
Gosh, I thought there were so many other things to be offended by. I'm really relieved. I knew that the first comment was going to be that I offended somebody, but okay.
I'm not offended personally. I'm just offended intellectually.
Okay.
And I don't mean it personally. But I'm not sure what moral status means. Why somebody with higher cognitive function is of greater value and entities with lower cognitive value. I don't know what worldview or picture your moral status determines what happens. I've never seen it. It's not like Thomas Jefferson figuring out whether it's okay to own slaves because they're of lower moral status than he is. You get the same argument that you're talking about here. Not that I value having people who are impaired not being moral. I don't think that moral status is the right term for putting value on life.
Well, what do you I mean, now I'll have to ask you the kind of question I ask my undergraduates. I'm sure you believe that I have much stronger reason not to go run over a person as I drive home than I have not to run over a squirrel. Why can't I articulate that view, which is one that I actually hold? Now, I'm trying to cast doubt on some of the distinctions to which we attribute great moral significance. But I don't think that all living things are equal and have equal value. But I'm not a Buddhist. Well, if Buddha, I guess I would, it's not that it has lesser value, but if Buddhism tells me that it would be just as wrong to kill a snail as it would be to kill my next door neighbor, then what I'm pretty sure is that Buddhism is just false, at least on that score. And I bet you believe the same. Just because somebody believes it, just because somebody says, hey, I'm a Buddhist and I believe that, doesn't mean that it's true. There were two people in the back. I'll take the one on the right first, and then... Yes. Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. I should have said something about that. Yes, that explains a lot, I think, a lot of our practical reluctance here. That is, unless it's available to everybody, and we all, I mean, the two possibilities, everybody advances by an equal amount or everybody advances to an equal level. Those would be two ways of securing some kind of equality. And what we know is, in practice, that would never happen. It's going to be like everything else. The really rich people are going to get it and give it to their kids, and the rest of us aren't going to get it. I think you're just entirely right. As a matter of practice and policy, one of the greatest worries is inequality of access to this stuff.
You have an implicit assumption that a moral obligation to a being depends only on the nature of that being, and not sort of social environment in which we're both present. So I think that's wrong in that our obligations to someone's pet dog are very different to our obligations to a wild dog. So because not just for the dog's sake, but for the sake of all people that have moral status that love the dog.
Yes.
I mean, in some sense, to try to make distinctions among human beings based on their cognitive level, who is morally worthy and who is not, leads to a social, to a general society intelligence that would be evil in itself.
Okay. Good. I agree with that too. I don't think that the only source of moral reasons is an individual's intrinsic nature. I think that's perhaps the dominant source of moral reasons for us. That is, we have moral reasons to respect different kinds of beings that kind of correspond to the worth of their individual natures. But we also get moral reasons from our relations with other people, with other individuals. And I'm glad you mentioned pets, because one important fact here is that we can have very morally significant relations with non-human animals. Actually, one of the best books that I know of that's been written describing a particular instance of these relations was written by a retired professor of philosophy here in Princeton, George Pitcher. His book is called The Dogs Who Came to Stay. I think it's out of print, but I recommend that really highly. It's an absolutely wonderful book. Even better because it was written by a philosopher. And even better because he's a local guy here for you. But I agree with what you say, that we have moral reasons to treat some individuals with certain forms of respect that may not be given to us by those individuals' own intrinsic natures, but by the fact that they are related to other individuals towards whom we have reasons to be respectful, and so on and so forth, and there's a whole network of this kind of thing. But I think there's, one point I do want to make is that I think that there's got to be, that if you want to defend what is really the common sense view about the, sorry to use the offending term, the moral status of the radically cognitively limited, you've got to say more than that. And for the following reason, I'm perfectly happy to concede that we all have moral reasons to be especially solicitous about the well-being of the radically cognitively limited, in part just because they all are somebody's child, somebody's sibling, so on. But if we imagine intelligent Martians coming down, and we have to tell them, we have to try to reason with them about what what the limits are to what they should do on Earth and so on. We're going to say, look, you have to respect us. We're rational, self-conscious, know the difference between right and wrong, and so on. And they say, well, what about the radically cognitively limited? How can we treat them? Should we take your behavior towards animals as our guide there? We can't say to them, but wait, you're specially related to them, because they're not. They're Martians. So they're not part of our network of moral relations. So we've got to know what we can say to them. I think here, and then those two back there. Yes, so go ahead. Thanks. Well, it's capability of a sort, but it's not what I would call sort of intrinsic capacity. It extends our abilities in certain ways. I guess one of the things that one might have to think about, and certainly on the horizon, would be the possibility of, I don't know how to describe this, sort of integrating certain kinds of computer technology actually into the human brain or whatever, so that we don't have to have it extrinsic to us. So far, but yeah, I guess there are people like that in Star Trek and in the science fiction movies and so on. I mean, there's nothing that philosophers can think of that hadn't been done in science fiction. So I'm sure that if I read science fiction, I would be able to give you examples of people who are, who have bionic brains or whatever it is. To the extent that inorganic computational devices could be integrated into our own consciousness without our loss of identity. So these would just be kind of supplementary to our core consciousness generated by our brains and so on. You could see these things as actually expanding our intrinsic capacities, yeah. Except that it's inorganic. I mean, that would be the difference between sticking computer chips in our brains and inserting genes that would actually cause our brains to grow and develop sort of endogenously. But yeah, I do think that the same kinds of issues could be raised by an integration of non-organic computational material into our brains. Yeah. So maybe we're closer than even I think. Yeah, in the corner. Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are examples that fit nicely with the sort of two parts of my talk. The first part on disability. I don't know what percentage, but a pretty significant percentage of deaf people deny that deafness is a disability or a disadvantage at all. And in fact, for them, it's more like an identity, like a collective identity. Instead of it being they are the Serbs or whatever, they are the deaf. And they want their children to be part of their special little community. Right? Or maybe it's like a religion, too. People want to raise their own children in their own religion. The deaf want their children to speak their language and to be part of their community. That's an awfully difficult issue. My own view about that is a little unsympathetic to the arguments of the deaf community activists, and that is that I think that what's actually going on is that deafness is a disability, and it's intrinsically a bad thing to lack this kind of capacity. And what they're doing is they're mistaking the fact that there's a compensating advantage to them as members of the deaf community, namely they can be part of a community that has its own identity and solidarity and special sympathy that they share because of the shared disability. And that's something that most of us who aren't deaf don't have anymore. People used to have that in small communities. People were parts of cohesive groups. And I mean, I think that's one of the things you see in the nationalist movements that we've seen around the world in the past couple of decades, that people really do like and need psychologically this sense of belonging and identity and everybody being part of one big, jolly, happy family. And deaf people have that, and most of the rest of us don't. And what I think is they're just making a mistake. That is a compensating advantage for them. But to deny that deafness is a disability, I think, is just a mistake. The thing about athletes and doping, I think the best reason for objecting to doping in sport is just that if some people do it, everybody's got to do it if they're going to remain competitive. So if we allow some people to do it, that forces everybody to do it. And I think that there are a lot of athletes who would prefer not to take all this dope. I mean, it can't be that good for you. So I think we have to regulate it and ban it, probably in most cases for that reason. But well, I mean, in some ways, that works out a little bit differently because life isn't quite, like a competitive sport. So if we can create some super smart people, maybe they will get a lot more from being smart than we will from having them around. But if we've got some really super smart people who can think better about physics and engineering and so on than we can, all the rest of us could benefit as long as we give them a niceness gene and give them a generosity gene as well, and then we're okay. I mean, you don't want to have a cognitively enhanced Hitler, but if we could have some guarantee that they'd be nice, even having a few of them would probably be a good idea. Should I take one more? Yes. Yes. Well, that would be a change. Yeah, the problem is I'm just not smart enough to figure out what their solution is, you know, or what it would be.
Great set of questions.